Chapter 27, Traitor's Gate. All along the battlements of the Tower of London, Alfred could make out members of the fearsome Royal Guard. They had their laser guns pointed down at the river. As the royal barge approached the gate, it was raised. Creak. Like so many traitors before him, down through the centuries, this was the way the boy was going to begin his imprisonment in the tower. With his hands and feet in chains, he was taken off the barge. Then he was bustled down a series of stone walkways until he reached the prison block. Inside, what hit Alfred first was the stench. It was medieval. And then there was the noise. Constant cries of pain. Ah, help, please. The Tower of London was the worst place Alfred could possibly imagine. Prisoners were crammed into tiny cells, as many as a dozen to each dark, damp little space, and treated worse than any animal in a zoo. The prisoners' faces were blackened with dirt and hollow with hunger. They were dressed in rags with no shoes on their feet. When the boys were marched past the cells, some called out, "Who's that boy?" "Is it Prince Alfred? What's he doing here?" One toothless old lady just laughed and laughed in a way that made you think she must be mad. Ha ha ha. A boy held out his hand to beg, "Please, please." Alfred wasn't sure what exactly he was begging for. Mercy, he supposed. Not that he could give it. The prince was now one of them, a prisoner too. He continued past his fellow inmates. Was that old man in chains once the commander of the British Army? One night he had vanished from the palace. And was that man with the long grey beard the old chief of police? He hadn't been seen in decades. Was that the Britain's last Prime Minister, shivering under old dirty blankets? She had been arrested just before Alfred was born. The Tower of London must have housed hundreds or more of so-called traitors. The prince was desperate to catch sight of his mother. Was she still even alive? As Alfred was dragged along the rows of cells, he turned to the guard and said, "I'm your prince, and I demand to see the Queen." But the guards just ignored him. Instead, they tightened their grip on the prince's arm. "Ow!" and continued to march him to his cell. Once there, the guards hurled the boy inside. Oof! The chains around his arms and legs were unlocked. Clink. The door was bolted behind him, and Alfred ran to the rusty iron bars on the door to his cell and shouted to the guards, "You can't just leave me here to rot." But they just had. The prison cell hadn't changed much since the Tower of London had been built in the 11th century. The walls were dark stone and hay was scattered across the floor, and in the corner crouched a small wooden bucket. Alfred presumed this was what he had to do his business in. Being born a prince, Alfred was sure he would never have to go through life with ever having to do his business in a bucket, but he was wrong. While Alfred felt that brief sense of bliss that came with finally having a pee, he could hear the tapping on the ceiling. At first the boy was irritated. This was really putting him off his pee. But as soon as he had finished, he stood still and so that he could listen. 3 in a row, the same rhythm as before. Alfred wanted to tap back, but even on his tiptoes, he wasn't tall enough to reach the ceiling. If only he hadn't filled that bucket with pee. He could stand on it. There it was again. Oh, never mind, thought the boy. There was a tiny hole in the corner of the cell, down which he carefully poured the yellow liquid. It trickled through the hole. "Oi!" came a deep voice from below. "You dirty little blighter!" "Sorry," he called back. He had only just been in the Tower of London for 5 minutes, and he'd already upset one of the other prisoners by pouring pee on his head. Next, Alfred overturned the bucket and stood on it. His hands just reached the ceiling. He clenched his fist and tapped back. Then from above there was another 3 taps. Alfred began to feel a little silly. What on earth was the point to all of this tapping? Suddenly he heard some scraping from above. Whoever was up there was trying to scratch a hole. Alfred jumped down off the bucket and onto his hands and knees, searching the floor of his cell. He looked for anything sharp that he could use to dig from his side. Nothing. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that one of the stones in the wall was jutting out. Using the bucket, he smashed down on it. Bash! Chipping a bit off. Chink! Then Alfred climbed back onto the bucket and began scraping away at the ceiling. Outside, he could hear bootsteps approaching, stomping the Royal Guards on patrol. Alfred leapt down and pretended to be going to the toilet by sitting on the bucket. When the guards peered through the metal bars, the boy called back, "Do you mind? I used to be a prince, you know." The guards shook their head and moved off. Immediately, Alfred got back to work. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Eventually, grit fell down onto his face, and as the hole was broken through, Alfred put his eye up to it. An eye stared back. At first he was startled, until he realised he knew that eye better than his own. It was his mother's.